Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Guro Samuelsen, a PhD fellow here at the South Asia Department at the University of Oslo. And I have the pleasure of being chairing this session. The session is entitled Feminism and the Politics of Gender in Indian Society. And to address this very important and, of course, very broad topic, we have two speakers with us who, in a sense, represent two generations within the research on Indian feminism. Raka is professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. In 1999, she published Fields of Protest, Women's Movements in India, which explores the political and cultural factors that come to shape feminist mobilizational strategies in different ways, arguing that social movements are shaped by the political fields within which they operate. Professor Rai has edited and co-authored several other important volumes on the politics of social movements, the meanings of the cultural dominance of the middle classes in contemporary India, and on the everyday reproduction of gender and class inequalities. The second conversant is Dr. Srilla Roy, Associate Professor of Sociology at Wits University in Johannesburg. In 2012, she published the book Remembering Revolution, Gender, Violence and Subjectivity in India's Naxalbari Movement, which focused on the participation of women in the Naxalbari movement in the 1960s and 70s. Dr. Roy has studied issues of gender and sexuality, cultural memory, violence and trauma, the effective economies of social movements, and the politics of development and neoliberalism. And she's currently working on a new book that explores new mobilizations around economic empowerment and sexual rights in India, and how these mobilizations affect and change the landscapes of Indian feminism. So I know for several of us in the audience, this is a very much awaited session that I'm looking forward to a lot. We have a little less than an hour for the conversation, and then a similar time slot for Q&A afterwards. And with that, please.
Thank you so much. So what I thought we'd do is, in fact, we're going to try not to speak for an hour, because I think that there are many people in this room who have also thought and acted as fundamentally important parts of gender activism in India, and so we're looking forward to a longer, a joint, more participatory conversation. But we will, we thought, begin by talking a little bit about the changing landscape of gender politics in India today, and also the changes in sort of the lived practices of gender. And we'll begin, we thought, by actually the 1999 book that Gul referred to, because I think that when I wrote the book, and having done research for the book in the early to mid-90s, it is a book that actually was described, I hope accurately, what the fields of the women's movement looked like at that time, really before an explosion of sort of new formations, which Srilla has written about. So when I wrote the book, I was writing it at a time when I wanted to actually think about the women's movement in India as something that you couldn't think about as one women's movement in India, but as something that could also was deeply local. So it was deeply affected by local political culture, local political history, and I took as my example the cities of Bombay and Kolkata, where the political histories and political culture enabled very different issues to be politicized. So given, CPM in Kolkata, in order for an issue in Kolkata to be thought of as legitimately feminist, it had to be linked to labor in some way. And in Bombay, which had a more sort of open political field, but was sort of resisting some of the organized left, the issues really became sort of far more couched around sexual violence, right? And at that time that I wrote, the key division in the women's movement was between sort of autonomous versus the affiliated women's movements, affiliated to political parties versus autonomous. And through the 80s, it was, one of the big debates. So you had the autonomous women's organizational meets. So it was so at the moment that I wrote, I was trying to emphasize the local specificity and importance of local cultures on the one hand, and how autonomous and affiliated organizations negotiated this terrain. And shortly after I wrote this, there was sort of an explosion of NGOs. And I think the terrain really began to change. And I'm going to turn it over to Srilla to actually talk about the more contemporary terrain.
Okay. Thanks, Raka. And thank you so much. I mean, of course, it's such a privilege to have this conversation with Raka. But I just want to say that just so many, I think people have said this, like so many of you have contributed to my thinking. So I'm very grateful, and it's a huge privilege. Okay, so just to give you, so Raka's book actually ends, as she says, it ends at the beginning of what Mary John calls the watershed decade for the Indian women's movement and progressive politics in general, which is obviously the decade of economic liberalization, right? And to put it very briefly, and I'll put it in two ways. So there's a shift in terms of institutions, and then there's a whole arena which is more recent of non-institutional formations. So institutionally, what we see, and Raka's already flagged that, is the rise of a new feminist formation, which is the NGO form, as Indrapal Grewal and Victoria Bernal has recently called it. And I think there, the implication, well, first of all, what happens is a lot of the autonomous women's movements that Raka was studying in the course of the 90s become NGOized, right? So they get foreign funding. They hire professionals with maybe degrees in women's studies, etc. And all of that together is thought of or has been analyzed in terms of the twin processes, or let's say 3-stage processes of institutionalization, professionalization, and transnationalization. So I often think of NGOization and transnationalization as twin processes, right? Because NGOs are receiving foreign funds, and we see then a scaling up or a reconfiguration of the sites and scales of the women's movement, where the women's movement, which up until that point had been really centered around the nation state, starts to speak to audiences at different scales, especially the global and the transnational. And then for me, and this is what I'm trying to work out in the book I'm writing currently, is what is the implication for activism and activists, right? As activists now start to engage in terms of feminist politics at these different sites and different scales. The other thing that, of course, happens with this form of institutionalization is the inclusion of activists into fields of governance, and these are state and non-state, and also into, more specifically, the biopolitical management of particular populations. So suddenly women's groups and more recently LGBT groups start to be directly involved in the management of populations defined as vulnerable, and these could be categories of women, of LGBT queer, and more recently transgender. So again, and this is something I'd like us all to sort of maybe talk about. What is the implication? How does activism change? And very briefly, in my thinking, I think what happens is obviously that feminist activism enters a competitive market of activism, where it has to now, NGOs and organizations have to compete for limited pockets of funding. What also happens is that activists who initially were very anti-state start now to partner with states. So we have, Aradhana Sharma's work on looking at NGOs partnering with the state in a whole new form of the GONGO, the governmental owned non-governmental organization, and so on and so forth. And the rise of expertise also makes a huge difference here to the way in which feminism gets reconfigured. So I think, yeah, I think some of that is quite well known, and I'm happy to talk more about that. The other, I think, more exciting development that we've seen recently, and of which I think the anti-rape protests at the end of 2012 in Delhi are emblematic, is this whole other kind of rise of campaigns and movements around women's issues and around issues of gender justice, right? So leading up to the Delhi rape, if you remember, through the 2000s, we see suddenly a lot of middle class people coming together around the murders of high-profile women, like the Jessica Lal case and the Arushi Talwar case, right? And these are obviously not people who are necessarily affiliated to the Indian women's movement or even left groups. They kind of inhabit this new category of the ordinary citizen, right? So you have these citizen collectives coming in. And I think the Delhi rape then takes that to a kind of crescendo where there's an explosion of protest action around ostensibly, gender justice, against rape, by a whole lot of people who are not affiliated to political parties, who are not affiliated to the Indian women's movement, and who may not even identify as feminist. And so what's so interesting about that moment is you see this really wide dispersal of feminist ideas and its ability to hail all sorts of people, right? And what has been so retroactively read into that moment of protest is the formation of sort of two publics, and one which has been called, as Kavita knows, because she was sort of the, the poster child, I would say, of that public, which is the Azadi, the Azadi group, who were calling for greater freedom for women as opposed to against discourses of protectionism and victimization. And then, of course, you have what Pratiksha Bakshi has called a retributive public, who was asking for the death penalty, castration, etc. But my point basically is that at this moment, we see this kind of we really see this explosion of a feminist common sense, and also a kind of crisis, which was really articulated, I think, by some members of the Indian women's movement, not all, as to what is feminism, right? What is feminism now, if you can ask for the death penalty in the name of feminism? And I think that's become, I mean, even post the Delhi rape, I mean, that's been a continuous thread, that there are all these campaigns, there are all these one-off events. And so again, just to give you a flavor of some of them, and as you know, so in urban areas, there's been a whole lot of an explosion of mobilization around the issue of women's public safety, right? So you have campaigns like Pinjra Tod, you have Why Loiter, Blank Noise, some of those precede the Delhi rape, some have become more visible after. You've had the slut walk marches, the Kiss of Death campaign, et cetera, and all of these, sorry? Oh, yes. Kiss of death. Well,
she meant kiss of death.
For some people, it really was the kiss of death. So yeah, it's an odd Freudian slip, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, now I've completely lost my train of thought. Yeah, sorry. So but what is interesting is that a lot of these are middle class and metropolitan. They're middle class and metropolitan led, which is a very, I mean, as you obviously know, that's a clear shift from the mainstream Indian women's movement, which was very consciously always spoke on behalf of the subaltern, on behalf of the rural, impoverished woman, right? And was often quite defensive about its middle-class status. In fact, quite erasing of that middle-class status. But now you have young women who are not defensive about being middle-class metropolitan, but are arguing that these issues have wider extension. So the issue of women's public safety is not a middle-class issue. It's an issue that affects all women. And Pinjra Tod, I think, has particularly been quite strong on that. Do you want to come in?
No,
here?
I mean, I sometimes, I don't actually have a coherent reaction to many of these, so you have the Why Loiter, all the sort of reclaiming of public space. I do think it's a really, really good thing. And I think it is very, very metro-based. It doesn't have to stay metro-based. I mean, it's an issue that can, you know, because public safety is something that all women are concerned with, particularly working class women who have to be outside of the house much more. So it doesn't have to stay at that level. I think it should proliferate more. But I also think that I've been thinking about the ways in which we now see the public engaging with what we consider feminist issues, but without a feminist politics. And I think that that's something that we're grappling with, and it's not just with the after the Nirbhaya case, though it was most evident then. But I think that we see it over and over again. I was just at a talk about sexual assault in India, and it was very much about numbers and statistics and interventions, but it seemed like very little from sort of the sorts of interventions that feminist movements had first brought to the fore were actually being considered. And to me, you know, I want to go back to the question of NGOization, because, you know, feminist politics, as Nivedita Menon said, you know, you have politics at the level of the nation, you have politics below the nation, and you have politics above the nation. And precisely, I mean, this is not particularly new stuff, but precisely because of the funding structure, I think, of many of the NGOs, I actually think what has happened is the funders or the parental organizations of these NGOs have now worked through a series of campaigns, like 1 Billion Rising, like 16 Days of Activism to End Gender-Based Violence, or, you know, encouraging sort of global celebrations of International Women's Day. And the way in which these campaigns work is that they contact all of the groups that they're funding with a limited supply of money, but also a supply of themes and memes, right? Which then the local NGOs are supposed to localize. Right? But they've actually come from the sort of, actually the US and England, but the local NGOs are supposed to sort of indigenize these themes. So I think that one of the problems with that is that feminist theorizing has come a really long way. We are far more nuanced about how caste and race and religion and gender identity work together. But these campaigns don't. It's as if all of the theorizing that we have done on the ground have no relationship to the ways in which violence is, you know, against women is constructed as these sort of global campaigns come down to the local level. And then it's up to the local level to try to say, okay, but what about in this case against Dalits, or in that case, you know, they insert sort of intersections, you know, at the local level. But I think that the problem really is a huge disjuncture between, I think, very sophisticated feminist analysis that understands that caste and religion and class and gender are co-constituted, and that isn't at all apparent in these global campaigns. The other thing I want to say about this is, again, thinking about the level of the global, is that another way in which global organizations work, and not just organizations around gender, but organizations around education, health, all of these, is they have what I call is a modular approach. That is, they will say, all right, I'm going to actually give you an example from a student of mine, Gauri Vijay Kumar, who wrote this wonderful, who's done this wonderful work on HIV/AIDS and sex worker activism in India, and she actually shows how, you know, we all know about the Shonagachi, you know, the success with reducing HIV/AIDS in Shonagachi, right? So what the Bill Gates Foundation does is they look at Shonagachi, they look at its success, and they say, okay, this is great. they make it into a module and they start shipping it around. They take it to Bangalore. Then they take it to Kenya, to Nairobi, right? But at every level, they're leaving behind that which made Shonagachi successful, which was a real level of political engagement. So when they take it to Bangalore, they leave the political engagement out, and what they keep is, one of the things they did in Shonagachi is they actually had sex workers working very closely together, talking about different practices, different daily routines in order to empower themselves so that they could, in fact, insist on condoms and things like that. So they left that politics behind, and when they went to Bangalore, what the Gates Foundation does in Bangalore is to keep that part of the movement that had to do with enumerating and classifying practices, right? They took away the politics, and now it is all about details about the sex worker's life and all. So as if you can get more data and classification, this is going back to your point. I mean, it's very sort of Foucauldian. So it was really an analysis and enumeration of all these practices with no politics. And then they move it to Nairobi. So I think that we're in a world where these modular forms of interventions are becoming more and more popular around sex work, around violence, and I think that's quite that's sort of worrying. It's worrying for me. And but on the other hand, I think even as we talk about these transnational forms, I think precisely because there are all of these other nodes from which activism is coming forth, and and there are plenty of organizations that don't embrace this. I worry that this has become too dominant, but I know that there are also other organizations that are much more mass mobilization based, and and obviously our work is how to keep working with them, how to increase their reach.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree, but I do agree, but I caution, and I wonder if here the generational divides might reflect, just to suggest that I don't think it's necessarily a global configuring the local, right? And again, the Delhi rape is a really good example of the way in which a local event travels much further than most events of that sort, and also produces transnational knowledge around violence against women. So the Delhi rape then gets evoked in contexts like the US or even in South Africa, not just as commentary on India being the rape capital of the world, but also as India now becoming a model of how to resist against gender-based violence, right? So what I'm saying is that I don't think it's just the North setting the agenda in terms of gender justice and then the South simply replicating that. And empirically, we can see this quite easily in the way in which even in, from the Beijing conference of 1995, we actually see the rise and dominance of Southern organizations over Northern ones. So Southern NGOs and organizations now start to determine the agenda. They set the agenda in terms of what are the issues which count at a global scale. Unfortunately, I think Raka's assessment actually does hold for the ways in which these Southern organizations eventually do their work at an everyday level, where they do often, reduce gender to something very narrow, to something very rarefied, and then it's sort of replicated in various contexts. I suppose my only point is that I don't think it's driven as much by the North than at various scales. The other thing I just want to say about NGOs is, the very term NGOization, and I think this is now accepted, is not really being used as an empirical referent, right? It's morally loaded. It's making a normative claim about what NGOs are doing to feminist and other kinds of politics and activism. And I would just caution with that because, and again, this recent edited volume by Indrapal and Victoria Bernal really makes that point of what does that, what does this paradigm then erase from view, right? What does it make legible and what does it invisibilize? And what it often invisibilizes is just how heterogeneous NGO practices are on the ground, how NGOs have become, particularly women's NGOs or feminist or NGOs working on gender issues have become a huge employer of young women, and how often the emancipatory possibilities of those NGOs are very much in terms of these women who they employ and who are inadvertently politicized in these NGO spaces in the face of the lack of now politicization on campuses or strong left-wing movements. So NGOs often act as the space of politicization for these women as opposed to the actual beneficiaries of NGOs who receive very little at the end of the day.
No, I mean, of course I agree, and of course I agree that it's morally loaded. It's just that when any one form becomes the dominant form, I think we have to be particularly careful. So yes, you know, are there flows from south to north? Yes, of course there are. But I tend to think that that the ideas flow south through south.
Yeah.
And I think what the south gives the north is legitimacy. That is, I think that, you know, northern funders feel like very legitimated when they, when they work successfully with NGOs in the south. So I think the south gives the north.
Absolutely.
And this is maybe generational. I will accept that, but that is still how I think. I think the south gives the north legitimacy.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And one has to just see that in terms of the way in which, you know, the third world woman is still the primary subject of development, right? And it's even as development has changed from, let's say, state and welfare-focused development to more neoliberal models of development, and even if that the figure of the third world woman has shifted partially from being the victim to now being agential, entrepreneurial, etc., it still is the third world woman whose body and agency provides legitimacy to development at an international level. I mean, the other thing, I think I'll bring it in now, and we were talking about this before in terms of, you know, dominant feminisms, and the two things I think, again, the Delhi rape sort of makes us think about is the ways in which Indian feminists' relationship with the state has reconfigured. So again, remember the time that, you know, Raka's talking about and has researched and written about, the Indian women's movement was really characterized by a strong and healthy skepticism towards the Indian state, if not as being anti-state, right? I mean, even as, you know, legal reform has always been the main strategy, it was always done very skeptically. It was never done with a lot of enthusiasm or a lot of belief in the state, so much so that, you know, Nivedita Menon, again in the early 2000s, writes a book where she basically says, you know, the feminist faith in the law and the state is over. Like, this is over and we need to move on. And so then what's very interesting to me is that just now in 2017, Prabha Koteshwaran has written a piece where she says that now Indian feminists are pro-state. Right? And Indian feminists now are working very closely with the Indian state. And just one example from the Delhi rape is the Criminal Law Amendment Act, right? Where, you know, where lawyers or feminist lawyers were not positioned simply as lobbying the state, but were actually, you know, part of drafting new laws. So again, I think this is open to debate, and Prabha's piece has attracted a lot of criticism. But I do think there's something to be said about how governance feminism is emerging in the Indian context, where feminists have actual institutional capacity and power, in a way in which that it's not enough to theorize feminists as being in a marginal or powerless position. I think we do have to take seriously and think about feminists acquiring power and what are they then doing with power. So that's the one thing. And related to that is the fact that some people are now thinking of the terrain of Indian feminism as also being one that is very amenable to carceral feminism, right? The ways in which there's an increased reliance on the criminal law. And again, what does that mean in terms of the ways in which gender justice is being configured. And the other thing I'll just flag here, but I think we're going to come back to that later, also, which I'm kind of reading a lot about and seems to be gaining traction, is the idea of neoliberal feminism. But I think I'll park that for the moment.
I was thinking that, yes, of course, feminists are working working on the law. And I think it's because the courts are at this moment particularly active on a variety of issues with regard to gender. And so in as much as, I think that, whether it's Vrinda Grover or Indira Jaising, I mean, they have to get involved because so much is going on with the courts. And I'm actually very concerned. I mean, all of us who've been following a whole bunch of cases lately, I'm sure are just as much concerned with the courts, which are not only making pronouncements on the limits of free speech, but they're increasingly and arbitrarily producing judgments that sort of heighten what are considered to be sort of traditional values. So you have, one after the other, you have this, I actually can't remember, one of you might remember whether it was the Supreme Court or not, where they granted a divorce to a man on the grounds of cruelty because he refused his wife didn't want to live with her in-laws, right? And they basically say that Justice Dave, his name was, and he basically said that a wife's desire to leave her in-laws' home was inspired by Western thought, right, and violated traditional values of Indian Hindus. And then you have another time where, in 2015 again, the court now tells a husband that you cannot leave your dying wife, right? And that's all very well and good. He says, but this is what he says. He says, it's a man's duty to provide for his wife and protect her health and safety. Quote now. To a Hindu wife, her husband is her God, and her life becomes one of selfless service and profound dedication to her husband. So in return, he must be there. So these pronouncements are sort of an attempt to make it true, right? And I think that other judgments, including, that men are increasingly victims of false domestic violence claims. I mean, it's just, and then this Akhila Haria case, there's just so much, it's become such a site for the creation of sort of a neo-traditionalism, right? I think of this as sort of the Gramscian war of position being played out through the court system. And at stake, I think, is a combined battle for a particular Hindu vision of India, but also at stake is a global validation of that vision that we were actually talking about earlier today and yesterday. And so I think that that even though it's true that more and more women are working with the state, in some sense, if you're going to work legally and you're going to work against government lawyers, you are actually working with the state. So the courts actually have been a source of concern, at least particularly within this particular moment in history. The other thing I think that you were talking about, Srilla, is sort of the neoliberal, sort of neoliberal feminism, and I've been thinking a lot about sort of our notions of empowerment and how to rethink notions of empowerment, And I think maybe it was Dolly yesterday, towards the end of your conversation, you were talking about the ways in which, whether it's development, development organizations or, let's just talk about development organizations or microfinance organizations, where women are sort of the new favored subjects of neoliberalism. They are the ones who are being given the entrepreneurships, and their men, on the other hand, are being considered the dregs on society, those who have nothing to contribute. And I think that again, I think that this neoliberal assumption about women as those who are entrepreneurs of their lives, who will lead responsibilized and self-managed lives, and they will self-transform, and they will, I think that rhetoric is actually being embraced by many, many women. who see themselves as being much more liberated. And so on the project that I'm doing now, where I've been talking to women who have migrated from villages and small towns, women and men who've migrated from villages and small towns to Siliguri, from villages and small towns to Allahabad, and from villages and small towns to Bombay, where Siliguri is, okay, population 500,000, Allahabad 1 million, and Bombay, God knows how many million. But I've been talking to them, you know, they're all people who've taken a step, they've moved out of their original home, right? And now they've migrated. So I've been talking to them, and I've really been struck by the ways in which women narrate their lives. I mean, in the 30 years of interviewing women, I've never heard such an active acting agent, you know, I did this, they tried to stop me, my father refused to let me study, so I stopped eating and I was hospitalized, but I got my way. So they're really narrating far, you know, in astonishing numbers, the sense of overcoming obstacles at home, resentment against their brothers, and there's a sense of victory, right? But it's a sense of victory that that makes them feel like they've left the core oppression behind, which was the home. But now, in fact, they're all getting ready to enter the workforce, and you know, we don't, you know, so I'll follow them for 5 years. I'll see what happens. But I've just really been amazed at the ways in which they really have come to see themselves through this particular language. And I was thinking, you know, if we think of discourse in terms of incitement, then sort of the incitement to neoliberal transformation has really worked for this particular class of women that I've been looking at. And these sort of aspirational women have been called into being. Now, what will happen to them? I don't know, but I do know, you know, that we have to not think of them as simply exploited or simply empowered, and that whatever they're entering is a much more complex sort of web. Oh, and I'll say one more thing. I'd been reading a lot about in the literature about precarity, right? Precarious. Yeah, so precarity in terms of not having a stable job, and in terms of no stable jobs being sort of a precarious existence. The other thing that I found is that we have to actually gender the term precarity a little bit, because at least for these women, their precarity is a little exciting to them. Because I think they feel like for the first time that they actually are taking charge of their own lives, and their lives have always been precarious. It's always been dependent on their parents or dependent on their in-laws' approval of their behavior. So they, I think, have always had precarious lives. And I feel like, I'm not saying they want to be permanently precarious, but in these women, at this moment, there's this sense of excitement, precisely because there is a precarity. So I actually think that there are these terms in which we think about the economy and the world, and we have to like gender them a little bit more, because I think that that different sets of people, in this case, people with different life experience, have very different reactions to that.
Yeah.
I guess I'll say one more thing, and then you want to talk about sex work?
No.
Okay. All right. So then I'll say one last thing, and this is my present obsession, so just bear with me. I think that we've done so much work around, as I said, nuancing gender, but in terms of women, we really haven't nuanced our concepts of masculinity at all. We still think of as men as being sort of powerful as a group. And it's very clear that they are not powerful as a group. And so when you talk about powerless men, and by powerless men, I mean, in this case, men who are not likely to have jobs very easily. Men who are the older sons of farmers or the youngest sons of farmers who are sent to the city. And so my time in Allahabad, in particular with them, made me actually realize that, with the Nirbhaya, you had this sense of there was a woman, and women like her were moving into the cities, and they were aspirational, and they were doing it for their parents, and that they were the future of India, and that these men, the predators, were the dregs on India, and they were, so there's this whole discourse on loser men, right? And then you have people like Craig Jeffrey who say, okay, this is a class of, these men are a class of professional loiterers. And then you have Thomas Hansen who says, these are the people who do Hindutva, right? But most men who are powerless aren't actually joining Hindutva. They're not actually, so in the US, it's said, oh, they become terrorists. And so they're not actually becoming terrorists. They're not actually joining Hindutva. And I'm really interested in how we actually, in our politics, find a place for them to be positively engaged in creating transformations in their lives, in our small lives, to go back to today's conversation in the morning, in our small lives, in daily ways. How can men who may never be productive in the economic sense, how can they, find a sense of themselves? Because I was studying these men in these various institutes, right, who they're not going to college, they're going to these training institutes hoping they'll do 9-month training and they'll get a job. And they were the most abject group I have almost ever met. They were abject, they were obedient, they were terrified, right? The director of the institute, on the other hand, who was an ex-military man, really thought of himself as the thin blue line between them becoming sexual predators and decent citizens, right? So he would basically say, you can't wear Indian clothes. You have to wear a tie. So he makes these men come in a tie, and a shirt and a pair of pants, and he says, I said, it's very hot, why a tie? And he said, a tie helps you keep your neck straight and therefore focused, right? And, so you have to have a bodily discipline, right? Because these men don't have a bodily discipline. A tie prevents them from doing gundagardi, right? So he really has this sense that if he hadn't been there, if he hadn't, helped men, dress appropriately, they would actually resort to their nature, which is gundagardi. And I actually think that we have to we have to just rethink the space of these men, because it's not just that there will be trouble if we don't, but I think for their sakes we have to rethink the space of men. And so when we think about gender, I think we have to, since thinking about gender to begin with was about injustice and injustice and equality, I think we have to think about these groups of powerless men as well.
I mean, just a small point on men. I mean, obviously, I think it's just really striking with the recent judgment around Mohammed Farooqi. I mean, it's just so stark and transparent, the ways in which, the Delhi rapists were treated, and now how Farooqi is treated. And obviously, this is mediated by class. So I feel like it's actually now, I mean, completely open secret that it's only working class men and migrants who are going to be treated as intrinsically sexual predators and not men of other classes. But I did want to go back to the point about Jyoti, about neoliberalism, feminism, and I'll use Jyoti to talk about that, and then just to finally say something about sexual politics, which sort of links in. So yeah, I think a lot of, I mean, the analysis or the commentary suggests that this outpouring of public empathy for Jyoti Singh Pandey. I mean, right, that was the question, like, why this rape and why not, all the innumerable rapes which happen on a daily basis in India? And the short answer is that because the media worked extra hard to produce her as a particular kind of subject. And again, the shorthand there is as a neoliberal subject who is, aspirational, economically successful, and all of that comes to stand in for women's emancipation. And then, of course, the working class man is configured as the obstacle to, women achieving this kind of neoliberal fantasy. And where neoliberalism is also working as quite an important analytic, recently I've seen a couple of readings which are also analyzing or assessing some of these new feminisms like Weiloiter, Pinchar-Todt, etc., also as instances of neoliberal feminism. Why? Because apparently it's a politics that centers the self, centers self-responsibilization, and therefore abdicates responsibility from the state and consumption. So here my open question, which I'd like us all to think about, is whether every foregrounding of the self is intrinsically neoliberal. And can we think of what's happening, this kind of women acquiring agency, etc., as being exclusively informed by neoliberal rationalities, or are there other rationalities at work? Are there longer lineages? What role does feminism play, for instance, in the fact that young women, even in small towns, now have the language of the self? Does Indian feminism play any role in that? Has its vocabulary traveled, or are we saying that no, actually it's only neoliberal rationality at work here? I mean, I find that quite difficult, but I'm still trying to work through it. Where I find neoliberalism useful, I think, is when I'm thinking about and researching sexual politics. So that's the other major shift that's happened in the 90s, right? The rise of sexuality, sexual politics, and the queer movement in India, which has made enormous discursive and material shifts and changes. And it's fair to say at this point that queer lives are more livable than they've ever been before in India, right? I mean, there is in urban metropolitan areas, at the very least, if not also in smaller towns. The research is kind of varied on that ground. But here, I think what we are seeing is the ways in which gender and sexuality together work at various different registers. So if you think of legal changes like the Nalsa judgment, or if you think of social spaces opening up for queer folk, et cetera, you see the ways in which, at least this is the argument I'm trying to make, the way gender sexuality works to normalize caste and class distinctions and inequalities, right? So the ways in which metropolitan queer lives then erase the possibility of non-metropolitan queer lives and communities from achieving inclusion into let's say civil society, etc. And again, the ways in which this is working around transgender is very interesting. For instance, so as you know, with the recent legal judgment, now the category of transgender enables working class sexual minority subjects like hijras particularly to sort of move from, let's say, political society to civil society. But what I've seen, for instance, is a lot of NGOs who work around LGBT issues are now getting even more defensive and closing their boundaries and not allowing the new transgender category to take away resources, to take away their funding that they're getting for LGBT, but also policing hijras in terms of the politics of respectability and actually, saying, well, no, you're working class, and and so there is a certain production of the respectable queer and the non-respectable queer. So again, I mean, just to go back, neoliberalism works to a certain extent, but I think we're actually seeing very old forms of policing on the basis of caste and class. So I keep asking myself, what's the extra that neoliberalism is doing here? What work is neoliberal feminism doing, for instance? But yeah, open question.
So why don't we, with that open question, actually just throw it open to the group? Yeah?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
That's a brilliant idea. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if I had to tie it over with a question in between, but there's no need. Anu first.
Nandini was first, I think.
Okay.
I'll just talk now. Yeah, I mean, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I'm just going to launch straight into my questions with that. So I'm a bit kind of concerned about this sort of periodization of the women's movement engaging with the legal system, because it seems to me that although women groups sort of periodically talk about how their engagement has changed, in fact, since independence, there has been the same kind of engagement. Yeah. You oppose when you need to oppose, and you engage, whether it's the Dowry Act or Mathura or you know, Status of Women report in 1975, or the Sati case, or you know, now the criminal law amendment, etc. Yeah. So I'm not sure that this kind of distinction works. What I do see, though, however, is that in a way, the autonomous women's movement versus the affiliated women's movement issue has been settled to the favor of autonomous women. And the decline of the left, in a sense, and especially the kind of disappearance of mass rural women's organizations. We hear nothing about land rights as an issue. We hear nothing about, you know, so somebody like a Gail Omvet doesn't exist today as part of the feminist women's pantheon, kind of that, you know, people go and, I mean, there are a few people like Anuradha Talwar or Roma or whatever, but nothing particularly, you know, prominent. So I just perhaps thought that maybe that's a more useful framework to go back to for a periodization than this legal engagement versus non-legal engagement. And I was wondering if you could reflect on both these issues. Secondly, I just wanted to sort of flag the issue of Nirbhaya in a sense that perhaps it wasn't just that the media created her. It was a very, very brutal rape. I mean, it was something that, you know, it's not that everyday people's innards are taken out with iron rods. So in a sense, there was something to the media moment. There was also something to the kind of rape it was that does make it more of an issue than other kinds of things. Of course, there are equally brutal rapes in counterinsurgency which don't get talked about, but that's another issue also as well.
Just take a few, take 3 or something.
So I guess, yeah, this, I also want to kind of push back a little bit perhaps at the narrative that you've offered us and take you back to what I think both of you began with, which was in some sense a question about who is the subject of feminist politics in some sense, right? And so the kind of narrative that you've given us assumes in a sense that the moment of kind of, you know, academic production around gender sex, which also played, it seems to me, a transformative role precisely in the period that you're talking about, really unsettles this question of who the feminist subject herself is, right? So if one were to think about sort of, you know, Shah Bano and what happens thereafter to the, you know, triple talaq judgment, or the fact that, you know, the question of caste and Dalit patriarchy and so on and so forth was, in fact, it seems to me, one very dominant narrative that came to the fore precisely after the Dalit patriarchy and questions of caste and feminism. And, you know, and I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, when I did the gender and caste book initially, I was really accused of having betrayed people in Pune and Bombay and so forth that I had known, sort of feminists, you know, and the question was really, we've always taken on the question of caste because we did it by looking at rural women. I think this comes back also to Nandini's question about, you know, mass organizing and the way that questions of labor or rural women's questions had somehow been constellated with the question of caste so that one didn't need to raise caste as an issue at all. And now I'm putting together the second volume on gender and caste and the ubiquity of intersectional analysis, which is itself very troubling. I think Nivi has spoken about what this kind of, you know, geometric form of intersectionality assumes. So there has been a kind of remaking of common sense. So I'm wondering how you would think about the problem for feminism of feminist organizing. Right? Because the questions of caste, of gender, of sexuality, all of them seem to have really profoundly altered, you know, what you both began with, you know, what is feminism today? And so I wonder whether it's just the question of the transformations in feminist formation, or whether this other moment of kind of knowledge production by feminists themselves has really opened up that space in quite profound ways, which makes it very difficult to kind of suture all of those kind of iterations back together.
Can I add to that, the third one? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, I'll take the next one. Yeah.
Shall we do one more before you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to go? Sorry. I guess. So I guess this sort of relates to the previous two questions. I'm so sorry. Around the place of political parties in the transition you've mapped out. I guess in two ways. I'm wondering, every political party has some women's wing of some form, including the right-wing parties, which are very active. I don't know everything that they do, but they do things. And so, so I'm wondering how they sort of relate, how they fit into this sort of the overall map that you're putting together. And then I'm thinking, in my fieldwork, I guess Nandini's saying that Roma's organization is unusual. But where I was working, the BSP was in power, and the BSP was absolutely seen as an ally to Dalit women in all sorts of issues. And the BSP is a much larger organization than any NGO in the country. And then the move from the BSP to the Samajwadi Party was seen as, among other things, a relative decline in the possibilities that were available to Dalit women in seeking sort of justice for gender violence and things like that. So I'm wondering how, in this move to NGOs, I guess what's the place of political parties' women's wings and of political parties more generally?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, Nandini, I actually agree with you. I think that the women's movement has always engaged with the state when they needed to, and opposed when they needed to. I actually agree with that. I think that. I actually don't find a difference. I think that when I said, for me, I think that there's a certain density of what's happening in the courts right now. So I think that was my only point with regard to that. But I think that there was a skepticism at the very beginning, and that skepticism remains. But people still engage. And I think that skepticism has expanded, particularly with regard to conflict zones and, and the acknowledgement of the state's complicity in violence in the Northeast and Kashmir and gender. So I think that that feminist skepticism towards the state actually does remain. So I think that perhaps we are a little bit different on that particular line. In terms of the autonomous and affiliated, but I'm going to tie that to your question, Anand. I think that, the decline of the left is obviously linked to the decline of powerful women's wings of the left. Whether we always agreed with them or not, they were really important. And what you have is the rise of the women's wings of the right. And even in the early days when people were writing about that, even in the 90s, they understood that the women's wing, right-wing women's groups were extremely effective. They used a lot of the slogans that the feminists use, Hum Bharat Ki Nari Hai, Phool Nahi Chingari. They would march saying that. They would use a lot of the slogans of the women's movement. There is some work on this, but one person whose work I wish she had published, but she basically did work while she was embedded in the RSS women's wing for 2 years, and then she just lost her nerve and never published it. And she, out of sheer terror. And I feel, that it is a great loss because it is for sure the most powerful women's wing. They have paramilitary training. They practice imagining, with lathis, imagining the enemy is a Muslim predatory man. There's an absolutely organized and hyper-organized wing that people have been talking about since the 1990s. But yes, they're very, very powerful now. And Anu, I want to push back on your question. I think for the mainstream women's movement in the 1980s, rural women, Dalit women were not the subjects, they were the objects, you know, of feminist intervention. And it is actually, so the volume you wrote, or, you know, all of the Dalit women's writing has been a real struggle to actually make Dalit women the subjects, as opposed to what was earlier the object. So, and I think that in this sense, the problem of feminist organizing is, I mean, it doesn't really matter to me whether it's a feminist organization doing the work, right? It's what I don't want is feminist issues without a particular politics. So if Dalit organizations, mass organizations, they're taking on these issues, you know, with a certain politics, it doesn't really matter whether feminist organizations are taking them on or not, as long as, you know, as they're being absorbed, you know, which I don't know, they are somewhat and they're not somewhat, right?
I think there's a lot of reasons why the periodization, thank you, doesn't work. I mean, you know, the wave model doesn't work in the Western context, and I think this kind of temporal model doesn't work in this context either. Because, of course, as you're saying, you know, legal strategies, legal reform is absolutely at the heart of all the major mainstream feminist campaigns. And it even was at a time when Nivedita Menon was also producing skepticism around it. It was still the case that feminists always reached towards you know, legal tools as their main form of challenge, recourse, etc. But I think there are other ways. So for instance, autonomy. I mean, autonomy remains still a major normative ideal for even women's NGOs. And what's curious there is the way in which they then mobilize autonomy, for instance, in saying we have grassroots voluntary workers, and they're working in this NGO because, you know, for the love of the work as opposed to for pay, and that becomes a way of not paying them. But that's the way in which some of these organizations gain capital and their feminist credentials. I mean, in the context where we still both work, West Bengal, for instance, has a platform of ostensibly NGOs that come together. So it's meant to be an autonomous platform. So every time there's a campaign around the state, it won't be an individual NGO, it'll be all these like feminist groups as part of this platform. And they really are the face of the local women's movement there. And for them, autonomy is still, you know, very much part of the language and discourse. So it isn't that, you know, becoming NGOized has stopped any kind of affective attachments to autonomy or mobilizing autonomy for certain, you know, at least for the accumulation of particular forms of status and legitimacy and capital, if not any material gain. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of problems with, and even, you know, generational models are generally problematic, right? And part of the problem with the generational model is how young women are being positioned, and in both ways. So one of the things about the new feminisms is that they move away from the legal strategy. So they widen the discursive play. They use the internet, social media, etc. But again, I mean, there's been a bit of writing that shows how early, so-called early feminisms also did similar kind of, you know, cultural politics. A petition could very much be the same, would be doing the similar work as it did around the time of Mathura, or what was that unit called in Delhi School of Economics, or there was a unit around sexual harassment. Exactly. So there's a lot to suggest that actually it's not a story of disruption. You know, there's a lot of cross, if we want to use the generational model, there's a lot of cross, what's the word? I mean, cross travel and exchange. So yeah, so that's the thing about, I mean, periodization, yeah, just doesn't work. So so that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is I had a whole section on who is the subject of feminist politics, which I wanted to talk about, but I haven't. And obviously, yeah, that's the other big thing that happens in the 90s, where this subject gets really fractured in terms of caste, religion, and sexuality. And again, I think, Nivi Menon's work is very important here, where she says the subject of feminist politics is not woman, right? It's actually the production of a gender order that produces man and woman in particular ways. Yeah. But I have to say that on the ground, I mean, so even if this is happening at a discursive level, on the ground, and here I think NGOs play a very important role, there has actually been a narrowing and a hardening of gender in a very, very limited sense. So for instance, the NGO that I've been looking at for almost a decade, which does economic empowerment, pretty much told me that it's actually much easier to go into communities on the back of microfinance and talk about gender, but they can't talk about religion or caste at all. And that's really interesting, right? That's really interesting about how it's so gender has some kind of cachet, which makes it like really easy to talk to communities about. And these are communities that are highly mixed in terms of being Hindu and Muslim, and they can't talk about that at all. So even though at the discursive level we've had a broadening or a deconstruction of this category, I think on the ground it works in a very limited sense. And of course, the Hindu right here also plays a huge role, right, in terms of how the category of woman then gets attached to family, nation, community. I mean, love jihad, that's what it's producing. And that's also interesting for going against this, again, this dominant thing around neoliberal, individual, et cetera, because what you have, in fact, is the category of woman constantly being mediated and attached to communal and familial identities, and not being produced as an autonomous subject agent at all, right? About political parties, I think it's, incidentally, Atreyi Sen has done work on, very, very interesting work. I suppose for me, I mean, it's not all women's work is feminist work. Clearly. So for me, I'm not looking, those kind of, at least, political parties are not coming within my immediate sphere of reference. But yeah, but there's recent work on IDWA, which is still, doing very, very important work. Manuela QOT has also written about the BSP. So yeah, I think the arena of mobilizing women in terms of political parties is obviously a big arena. But as Nandini says, I think it's true that actually, when you said affiliated versus autonomous, and it's actually, yeah, the affiliated political has actually kind of been eclipsed from that landscape, right? I mean, we're not really talking about affiliated women's wings, right? And that's happened with the national conferences, where after a while, national conferences were just being attended by autonomous or NGOized women's groups, and political party women's wings kind of just fell by, and that obviously raised a lot of critique and criticism from within the women's movement.
Dolly, I think. Dolly was like hangover from last time.
Okay. All right. Okay. Some of what I wanted to ask you already have answered, so I'll just sort of cut my question short. One was, I sort of agree with you in terms of the Hindutva women's organizations and the arms training side of things, Raka, that you were talking about. And partly it is a case of how does that reconcile with the other aspect of their gender politics, which is women must make achar and that sort of thing, right? So you've got much more than in, Modi made a famous statement saying women should work in food processing because they are good at making papad and achar. And then he also said that parents of girls must plant 5 trees so that they can pay a good dowry when it comes time for them to get married. So, I mean, it is a much more difficult contradiction to put together in one basket of Hindutva, feminism. The other question is, one can talk about Congress and left and BJP as 3 parties through which one could talk about the term party feminism. Mm-hmm. But obviously there is also JDU and RJD and so on and so forth, which are regional and so on. Why do some parties feel the necessity to have a women's wing and address gender issues through that, and for others it doesn't seem to be a big deal?
Who doesn't have a women's wing?
Like RJD, Janata Dal United, parties
Janata
in
Dal
power.
United used to. I mean,
but I don't
know if
it's
RJD
not that they have a
does.
brand of kind of thing, So that's the fact that when we talk about party feminism, we're really talking about 3 parties feminism in terms of agenda setting, right?
No, and
yeah, I'm going to say, yeah.
Hi, Raka and Srilla. It was such a lovely conversation, and I'm just thinking about both of your amazing works, and just thinking about livelihood, microcredit, and in terms of, I think, the migration, migrant workers, gender relations. What would be useful to also think about would be to actually locate that in a very foundational theoretical framework like work. Right? How do we look at work? How do we look at labor, value? I think it's really important at this time as we're looking at really neoliberal terms, and also Shrila's amazing work on the NGOization that's going around, to both look at feminism, one, as an ideology, and second, as really a very strong theoretical and a political concept that we need to locate somewhere historically and make it relevant as a political project. And that's where it's related to actually what Nandini is saying in terms of where do we locate the women's movement here. And I think that was really helpful when we were looking at sexual violence and impunity in South Asia. Right, in terms of really locating within a historical and a political movement to trace that. And I think in both your amazing works, you have so much to contribute. And in a way, I think in Raka, in your work, in terms of looking at men, masculinity, to really trace it back historically and show us the trend, how we got to where we are in terms of looking at men as losers, or in terms of this amazing literature that's coming out, whether it's Blom Hansen or Craig, and not being able to tell us that story through a feminist lens, which is so much more important right now. And I think in Srilla, in your work in terms of NGOization and looking at women autonomous spaces, one of the important things actually to do is also to implicate ourselves in the human rights movement. And let's say in the nationality discourses that we have been having in the subcontinent, maybe since the 50s or the 60s, looking at the movements that I have been part of, really, the women's question and feminism and gender equality has been so absent. We have talked about liberation, we've talked about sovereignty, and suddenly these questions were so absent that after the ceasefire in the 90s, women just disappeared. That it's men who went into the negotiating table. And I think it's really important to be honest in terms of telling those stories. And South Africa can be a very good example, right? With customary courts still fighting not to let women to come in after that got their independence. And I think that's, in a way, really telling a very, very important story. And I feel that locating this in real political, historical substance would be so important. And the third point that relates to Subir's point about not forgetting resource extraction. And if we think about work and where women's value has been located, whether it's the palm oil industry in Indonesia, Malaysia, look at the kind of women who do the work in the palm oil industry, really the regenerating and reifying gender stereotypes. And I think it's really, really stretching it into neoliberal and also really the extractive regime resource wars where we're going in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. That was a lot to think about. I have just 2 or 3 points just to, not exactly questions, but just responses, which we can discuss. One is that I think, I think of a concept like autonomy and the different ways in which, say, the NGOs approach it in a way in which, autonomy is supposed to be asserted, but not in a way that threatens the state. Right? And not in a way that threatens, so it's basically, it's about autonomy vis-a-vis community, family, etc., but not really vis-a-vis the state. So I think the difference is what I see in the recent movements, and that is movements that are really spanning, they're not, I think they're blurring the boundaries between autonomous and affiliated, and autonomous is big, at least there's a glimmer of that it's not only beginning to mean NGO. So say something like Pinjra Tod and the young women's mobilizations with left groups that I see in Delhi and elsewhere, all right? Or even the BHU women's movement, which is not with any particular organization or anything like that, but it's, so the issues of autonomy they are raising is autonomy from discriminatory and gendered restrictions, which are imposed, by the state. So the state invokes family and all of that in imposing it in state institutions, and of course in private institutions also it's reproduced. But then actually these are extremely restrictive, impositions. So it's a move. It's very, and it's defined itself as a movement against, so Pinjara Tod is particularly against restrictions in hostels. Yeah. But the thing is that these are also connections. If you look at it side by side with, say, women workers movements, women workers were also kept in hostels under similarly restrictive, with similar rationalizations of that. So those assertions of autonomy are threatening to capital. They're threatening to the state. And so I see, that distinction. And I see that, I feel that even in 2012-13, that whole, what Srilla called the Azadi moment is actually a very, very, the sheer range of young women in that movement who were talking about freedom from certain kinds of restrictions, and that included family, and that included community institutions, and it also included these kind of, the state and all of that. So the second point I wanted to make was the way in which, you see, when we talk about, say, Hindutva, whatever you call it, I wouldn't call it feminism at all, of course, but I wouldn't at all. But I think, what are they doing? They're trying to occupy that space, certainly. So if you look at, there's that really great film called The World Before Her, which is very interesting about how, how the women in the RSS organization and all of that, how they are dealing with that. But I think that at the same time, there's also this attempt to paint their, they are trying to craft up feminist politics whereby the Muslim is profiled, Islam is profiled, Muslim community is profiled as being anti-feminist, and so triple talaq, etc., is something we are championing, we are going to get it done. But I think that is a contested terrain, because there are Muslim women's groups also which are new, which were not there in the 1990s, and which are there, which have really become visible and very important now, which are also contesting that, to say that, the triple talaq judgment is not something this Modi achieved or the state achieved, but we achieved it and all of that. So there's that. And the third thing is, I think, just my last point, which is, I really feel that there is, in the last couple of years especially, we are in the midst of a backlash. And that backlash has, I think, a couple of layers. One is very much a direct political RSS kind of BJP government backlash, which is exactly targeting, they are trying to hit back at this new articulation of autonomy. So that is taking, BHU and so on is so important precisely because it is a pushback against their backlash organizing, which is happening. But the thing is that it is this whole proliferation of the love jihad cases and everything, and the whole attempt to hit back at the idea that women have a right to, do what they wish with their lives and choose their partners and their ways of life and all of that. That's under an unprecedented major attack. And the other thing, the other shape, and then it's also taking the shape of challenges to the, so legally 498A, etc., being undermined by the court judgments. And the other form the backlash is taking, I think, comes a little closer home, all right? Because I find that even these theorizations of governmentality and carceral feminism and all of that are really, in my mind, part of that backlash. Because I feel that, we don't talk about, there's no critique of carceral, feminism or carceral activism when it comes to, say, it's basically what was the feminist activism about? It's about challenging impunity, no? So the whole point was the recourse to the law. The feminists did not write the 2013 criminal law amendment law. In fact, the feminists have been the first to critique it, and rather than only to claim it, because much of it, even the Varma recommendations, most of them were not respected by the law that was made. It was totally in opposition to much of what we were asking for. But I think that some of the changes that were asked for so long happened at that moment, and it's happening only when a woman dies, So it's crazy that these changes happen at that point. But the point is that then this talk about you know, so if it was SC/ST Atrocity Act, for instance,
Exactly.
would one talk about
Yeah.
carceral, you know, would
Totally.
there be this kind of critique? So I think that, you know, the whole idea now, and there is actually, I mean, there is a certain kind of coalition now trying to undermine the rape law. In this context, you know, I think critique of the law, the feminists are, I think, doing it, you know, all the time. And the women's movement groups are doing it so much of the time. And not only the NGO groups and all of that, very much beyond that as well. So I don't, I mean, I see this particular moment as a backlash moment in a big way.
I mean, just very quickly on that last point. I mean, absolutely, and I think that backlash moment is very obvious in the first, the lower court judgment around Faruqi, right? Because then there's all this writing, and I think that's for the first time that in the mainstream press you have the use of carceral feminism, and that the law has gone too far. Feminists have gone too far, and that this is an instance of over-reliance on the criminal law. And I do think, yes, absolutely, that definitely is a kind of backlash logic. And obviously, Faruqi becomes the object because he is a privileged, upper-class man. And then suddenly there's all this mobilization to say that this is carceral feminism at work, as opposed to really embrace that particular judgment as a huge as a huge marker of success. I mean, the judgment, you know, in terms of what it says about consent, is probably the first time that you have an articulation of consent in those terms from, you know, the legal apparatus. So to undermine that and say it's actually carceral feminism was very schizophrenic. It was a very odd kind of moment. Nandini, did you want to? Kavita.
So I think it's also important to remember that this was, to some extent, a debate that was voiced by feminists themselves. So one of the people on the other side, the
Yeah.
bad side, according to you, was Lavia Agnes, who by no means is, you know, she has been one of the important figures of the feminist movement. And I think there is an issue. I mean, I'm not, without making a comment on this particular case or in general, I think that there can be various differences without calling it a backlash on this particular kind of issue, where you debate the death penalty for certain cases.
Right.
You know, there can be a variety of different positions born out of different kinds of concerns with the protections of criminal law and with an opposition to the death penalty.
Or even censorship. I mean, remember there was very spirited discussion amongst Indian feminists when it was about censoring India's daughter, to which you were also participant.
I mean, I have problems with the idea that she shouldn't have made a film, or that it should not.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't think that that's.
Me too. Yeah.
I want to say that I think the critiques about the law, for instance, about the death penalty, the law, for instance, about the definition of the age of consent, for instance, about even questions about a minimum sentence, etc. All those things can be, those are not things anybody is married to, right? I don't think that is the case exactly. What I'm calling the backlash is the attempt to label, and it is, I mean, one can't get away from the fact that that discourse is emerging around a certain narrative of male victimhood, and it didn't emerge over the 2012 Cambridge case. Okay? It didn't emerge to say that those men who were, actually hanged were victims of this kind of, carceral whatever. The discourse did emerge when the law, when young women who, I don't even say the law kicked in. Okay, the point is that young women who were beginning to felt, they could come forward now and give a name to an experience, call it violence. Call it violence rather than something they were supposed to shut up and put up with. So the invasion of bodily integrity, and they were not, they were describing, not all of them came forward to call it rape. They came forward to describe that this is the violence that happened without my consent. Right? The law names it then as rape and so on and so forth. But the point is that the kind of attack that has been launched on that very action of those women to come forward in cases of Tejpal or Faruqi and to say that this is a violation of my body. So I think the attack that
you don't really know what happened to you. You don't really know. Because what this second judgment is upheld is basically what was being instructed. The idea that you shouldn't really have made a big deal about this.
Right.
And that you should have, a case in which an acquaintance does this to you, or someone you love and admire does this to you, isn't really something to be called rape. Rape should be, kept for the cases. And that's been said now. After
Yeah.
that, Manisha Garai's daughter and all writing about this.
Suranya.
So she's been writing exactly saying the rape law is supposed to be kept for all those.
But you see, that's why
That
I
was the
think
point,
it
yeah.
is backlash, as opposed to different, heterogeneity of opinions and differences. I think because the object of attack somehow becomes feminism. I mean, that's what was mobilized in terms of Faruqi, the first round.
I'm guessing that we need to really distinguish between differences of opinion and backlash, and
Yeah,
not
sure.
that every case of a difference of opinion can be treated as backlash, or for instance
Yeah.
disagreement over India's daughters.
Right.
It's not a disagreement over the fact that
No, I
question about other kinds of freedoms to interview people
Right.
or to produce
yes,
ethnographic
and who can produce, and who speaks on behalf of whom, etc. No, I completely agree with you.
And for instance, Pinjra Code refused to take a prize in Erom Sharmila's name because she lost the Manipur elections, and they thought that, so what sort of, we're talking about autonomy, but autonomy of what kind of politics as well, right? So there are all sorts of issues that one can disagree with on all sorts of fronts without being made, and the problem with it is that it does then begin to sound as if you're some kind of anti-feminist, regardless of all sorts of other positions that you may take on various things.
I mean, I think the issue that around Faruqi, just for a second, I mean, that's that issue of consent that never goes away, right? It doesn't go away here. It hasn't gone away in the U.S. It just goes around and around and around. But in fact, carceral feminism is the feminism that says, the objection to carceral feminism is the objection that says that we are too happy to punish, those working class guys, because they are not one of us, because they are the ones who should be punished, right? So I mean, so the critique of carceral feminism actually comes from there, right? But I have to get back to a couple of things. The question about the right-wing women's groups that you brought up, Shubir, actually ties back to this morning's discussion. That when after Kavita spoke, and I think Ajanta was asking about sort of what do you mean by this contradictory consciousness, and I think that what you're raising, Shubir, is a sense that, okay, if you're making achar, then how can you be wielding a trishul? Right, but in fact, there's no reason for these things to be contradictory, right? So this is a creation of a particular political subjectivity, in which it is perfectly consistent to make achar with one hand and wield a lathi with the other, right? I mean, because there's no essence to any of this, right? This is a new political subject that has been brought into being. Through one lens it seems contradictory, on the other it's just it's a political subject that we haven't had to grapple with. But so it's sort of the constitution of these new political subjects that I think is actually really fascinating. I don't think of it as contradictory. I actually think about them as these new subjects that were created, and I just wanted to bring that in that conversation. Yeah, I think we've talked about backlash, which I agree, and I also think it's actually really interesting how we went from talking about the autonomy of women's organizations to the autonomy of women, and rights over their own body, and where that autonomy stops basically at the edge of capital. How far, can you control your body when it hits up against what capital needs and wants from you? And then just getting to Dolly again, I think that so much, even though there's been wonderful feminist work around it, so much of when we talk about class is that we don't actually talk about it as a gendered thing. So that when we're talking about, the absence of men's work. We just think of it as the absence of work as opposed to something that it does to their masculinity. And similarly, for good or bad. So there's a way in which I think that we have to all the time think about local, as you said, ideologies of gender and work that work together to produce certain kinds of laboring subjects who are women, what work they can do, certain women can do as opposed to other women can do, and and what work some men can do versus that's, oh no, that's my phone. How embarrassing. It's an alarm. Oh no, I can't even stop it. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop it. Oh, good.
Oh, okay. I mean, just briefly, Kavita, on the autonomy, I thought that's quite interesting because I remember reading, a piece by Uma Chakravarti where she really, spells out this whole kind of ideal of autonomy, and I think she does it in terms of organizational. So for the autonomous women's movements, autonomy was, of course, freedom from patriarchal control, but there's also this principle of organizational autonomy, which is, autonomy from foreign funds, from hierarchies. So, how organizations will run. And actually, the way you articulated it, it made me think of how much in my thinking, I've been thinking of autonomy strictly in that latter sense, right, as organizational autonomy. And maybe the new campaigns are a way of resurrecting that prior sense of autonomy, is autonomy from, and really broadening the scope of it, right? And that, again, is the importance of your Azadi moment, because it is the first time that freedom is articulated as a positive principle, right? It's not in a negative sense. It's also the expansion of women's freedom, sexuality, pleasure, et cetera, So we have a much broader field now, I think, in which we can talk about, freedom from patriarchy, and not just in a negative sense. So, yeah, so I mean, gosh, there was something else I wanted to say. Also, yes, and also so much of that has also been emerged out of, well, directly addressing moral policing, right? I mean, Pink Chaddi being, again, a moment in all of this. I mean, so much of that is about taking back the ground from, what you're characterizing as a backlash against women's freedom. So I think we can see this sort of, these two things happening at the same time: the rise of moral policing, the rise of, pushing back women, taking away their freedoms, and then a real spontaneity in terms of pushing back against that kind of moral policing, trying to reclaim spaces, and trying to do that in a collective and interesting sense. I mean, in terms of caste as well, I mean, I didn't talk about it. I think that's also a there are very interesting things happening around, using social media for particular kinds of caste, like, I'm sure like Dalit Diva and Roundtable, of course, but also making certain kinds of transnational links, right? And yeah, and I don't know what people think. I mean, there's obviously a way of thinking of that as like very irrelevant, or, as being very small drops in the ocean compared to like political parties, mass mobilizing, etc. But I don't know, one could arguably say that these are important shifts and important kind of formations which are doing proper cultural work, right? Of critique, of pushback. Nandini.
We're not done? No. Oh, okay. Oh, I see, okay. I actually wanted to go back to Nandini's question about what has been eclipsed, that even if we don't periodize in the way that some, that perhaps you suggested, and I wonder whether the increasing legibility of woman as a rights-bearing subject, right, whether that has meant an eclipsing of certain kinds of questions, like rural social relations, and the question of land reform as a properly feminist question. Absolutely. I mean, is there a way that the legibility of women, right, has created a sort of notion of an autonomous women's politics that has departed from some of these questions, which are equally gendered and classed and everything else, right? So, so what is the fallout of that kind of legibility, right? And I just had a sort of clarifying question for Srilla. When you were sort of pushing back against Raka's disquiet about NGOization, right? And you were saying, well, it's not really about sort of north-south control. And the one thing you did say was that there are sort of insidious ways in which NGOization has worked at the everyday level, but you didn't really spell out what that meant. And I wonder if you could just say a little more about that.
Yeah, I have a short question about these dangerous masculinities. As I'm sure you know, there's a very huge literature on dangerous masculinities, but you pose it in a different way, how to find some kind of affirmation in this black hole, which is, well, you have all the way from Teveleit, you know, writing about this Sturmabteilung in Germany, you know, taking huge pleasures in the most terrible excesses and violence, you know, where the violence itself becomes it, you know. Well, that's but a black hole, but you try to turn it away, you know, look in the other direction, how to give some positive affirmation to these dangerous masculinities. And it strikes me, when you talk about your subjects, which I've been talking to, you say you have never met people so much filled with fear as these people. It's interesting, you know, because maybe they have kind of adopted that same concept on themselves. They are dangerous, meaning that their way of becoming useful citizens and successful is disciplining, curbing their own nature, so to speak. Which is really a deep disciplining effect. They have to go with ties. They have to become militarized in a deep sense in order to not become gundas or rapists. And although it's only like tendentially speaking, your stories about these women feeling small victories, overcoming obstacles, tells about the opposite, a faith in their own nature, following your nature. While following the nature for these dangerous men are extremely dangerous, both for themselves and not the least for society. Well, maybe I'm not... There's a paradox there, you know, which is... and it's not only about these failed upward moving subjectivities, which should have been upward moving. But all the migrant workers, they are also dangerous. There are many dangerous migrant workers from Bengal in Kerala and from Bihar in Kerala. And they are, okay, commonly associated with the possibility of rape, for example. I don't know to which degree this has been internalized, maybe not to the same degree because it's partly alien discourse. And they don't stay there for so long, maybe. But still, you know, you can somehow see their bowed necks. They shouldn't show themselves too much in the public space because that is dangerous. So there are some paradoxes there, which is well, I don't have any contribution when it comes to the possible affirmativity in that, but there's something with the very concept of dangerous, which is dangerous, at least when it comes to these masculinities. And if you push it too far, you get desperate reactions and actions. Of course you do. That history always shows. My second question is about your questions about, is there any other way of designating this new subject, a neoliberal? Is another way of looking upon is any freedom neoliberal? I think that question maybe comes from a kind of theoretical impasse, where some kind of classical Marxism is the only opposition to neoliberalism. You could look in many other different directions to see ways of expression, not necessarily of the individual, but outside certain frames and certain patterns, you know, affirmations, which are not collective in that Marxist sense, but neither individualistic in the neoliberal sense. Of course, the multitude and concepts like that are pointing somehow in that direction. Yeah, and then I have maybe a question about this legality. Well, according to classical theory, some kind of basic constitutional protection is the very prerequisite for agency as such. It starts with this, and then agency becomes possible. That's a classical theory. But you can also turn it around with a kind of excess of agency. At some point, you will have to turn to this legal protection in order to protect it in some way. Maybe that's the point. No, I don't know.
So, no, I just want to come back to this worry about the women's movement and feminism being equated in terms of self-identification of who is part of the women's movement or not. And if you look at, if you sort of think, say, remind oneself of Saba Mahmood's work, where people do find freedom in other kinds of movement which would traditionally not be considered part of the women's movement. And a lot of women, I mean, okay, the RSS maybe the RSS Women's Wing may be taking up progressive issues, but a lot of people do find freedom in being part of that solidarity. Or Hadia, for instance, marrying, you know, so how is that not so a feminist statement in, and we don't, I mean, I think my concern with sort of the focus on groups like Pijra Tod or, you know, even the BHU women's movement ignores the fact that perhaps many women go to BHU precise, or, you know, there are levels and levels at which people want to kind of think about restriction and want to think about freedom and different ways. So, you know, even say Buddhist nuns or Jain nuns and how they think about freedom. So I think just the kind of emphasis there has been on being part of the self-identified women's movement and what it eclipses worries me to some extent. So.
Okay, so me.
I can go.
So the rights-bearing subject, Ajanta. I think that you know, the issue of land reform was always, like, in terms of the women's movement, it was always a kind of issue that other movements or some kinds of feminists were trying to bring to the fore. It never really got embraced, I think, by the feminist movement. So it's not that this issue has been eclipsed. I think that it goes back to my worry about sort of these overarching organizations like UN Women and people like that. I've been privy to the arguments around how violence against women should be defined. And people from the South are just continually saying, what about land reform? What about forcible exclusion? What about dispossession? And they cannot get it. I mean, it's continually moved aside. And violence against women is continually redefined in that narrow sense of one individual against another individual, you know, and maybe a little bit more than that. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, I think that this problem of like fundamental economic rights and the denial of these economic rights as a violence, you know, people have talked about it, but it's never actually come into the fore of feminism, of sort of global feminism at all, I think. let me address the Sabah Mahmood question. And I actually don't think that Sabah was talking about the people that she studied necessarily as feminist. Her critique was, why do we think of agency as something that has to be resisted, right? We understand agency as something which resists norms, but you can be an active agent and really have a project of the self that is sort of carrying through with these norms. So in that sense, you know, she was interested in these pious women's agency, right? And I think that, you know, we can certainly bring these ideas of agency to, you know, right-wing women as well. If that's what you're thinking. And no, it doesn't have to be feminist, but they're active agents. And I think that if we're not going to, we can't use the term false consciousness at will. Like, certain people have false consciousness, certain people don't. So no, I think it is a fair warning about always looking at women as if they are, you know, active agents, acting within constraints like we all do. But I don't think we need to call them feminist either. Your point, I mean, I think that the dangerous masculinities concept is a dangerous concept, and we have been not questioning it for too long. And I don't think that these boys actually think of themselves as dangerous. I think they just feel like they're afraid because they have to deliver the goods, and their families rely on them, and they have no way of doing that. So they don't think that they're going to go out and be sexual predators. They think that they have a job to do, and they're going to fail in that job. You know, the fear actually, the fear comes from there. And finally, I just think that when we say neoliberal subject, we're actually designating a moment in history, right? We're not saying, oh, that person is neoliberal, that person is not neoliberal. It's just the way in which market and state have come together to, I think, describe a particular historical moment. I think that's what we meant.
Okay, so Ajanta, the question on the increased legibility of the rights-bearing subject, I think where the subject of woman is most legible is, actually, I mean, this is where neoliberalism is useful, is as a consumer subject, right? I mean, I think that's where the subject is most visible. So the subject who is a consumer, who is economically aspirational, has economic success. You don't think so, Subi? And there's a way in which then women's consumption power comes to stand in for female emancipation. And a really good moment, a really good instance of this is what was held as India's first, it wasn't, but the first lesbian ad, which was for Anouk. I don't know if anyone saw it, but that was the perfect way in which you know, a lesbian couple comes out of the closet, and how is it done? Through consumption potential. And the right kind of consumption, right? It's the traditional modern. Which is the classic, like Rajeshwari Sundararajan, what she writes about in, you know, her book in 1992. But so it's wooden decor, ethnic apparel, but a poster of Clockwork Orange. It's all the right markers. It's a particular aesthetic, which is Indian but global, right? And that's how the lesbian subject is legible. So so immediately what gets invisibilized, what is not available, right? Which is non-metropolitan, non-middle class, and also having particular forms of cultural capital, right? It's not any wealth. It's particular kind of cultivated taste, distinction. All of that is being packaged for the queer consumer. So that's one way I think of responding to that. The point about NGOs at the everyday level, the small instance the small example I gave is the ways the kind of unintended possibilities or effects that NGOs have on women employed by them as staff. So these are often lower middle class to middle class women. They're not the intended beneficiaries of NGO work, who would typically be rural women or whatever, working class women. these are the staff employed by NGOs who often get politicized, not often, could get politicized, let's say, in these spaces, which is a completely unintended effect of this kind of work. They aren't the subjects of NGO empowerment or women's empowerment. But because they suddenly access the language of women's rights and are often participants of women's marches in the city, events, etc., they suddenly develop a kind of, there could be a politicization which couldn't happen otherwise.
No, I got that part.
Right.
I got that. You seem to be suggesting that there's another way in which kind of modularity of the NGO works to have sort of negative social effects.
Negative?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking about positive.
That's what I was wondering, because you sort of implied that in this discussion.
Oh, okay. Negative. Oh, gosh, there are so many. Where does one even start? But I'll give you an example which maybe links to Nandini's point. It's interesting that you think of Pinjra Tod as being part of the self-identified women's movement, because not a lot of people would extend Indian feminism to include these new feminisms, don't you think? Be that as it may, I'm actually writing a book where I'm not looking at Pinjra Tod. I am sort of peripherally, but my main objects are NGOs. And to that extent, I think I'm extending what I think is this object called feminism, or the sites at which feminist work happens. And normally they wouldn't be included. NGOs wouldn't be included in the imaginary of the women's movement. There's been a lot of resistance to thinking of NGOs as being sites in which feminism happened. And here it's quite complicated and quite contradictory. And to give you an example of the negative, so this NGO that I look at is trying to, and I've written a recent article on this, which poor Subir has been subjected to far too many times, is trying to stop child marriage. They go into a community, they're stopping child marriage. This young woman says she wants to marry this person, and the NGO kind of threatens her and threatens the whole community, threatens to stop the microfinance program in order to fulfill their feminist mantle of saving this young girl, right? But obviously it becomes so complicated, because what should they do then, right? Partly in a context where there's so much of a blurring between elopement, between love marriages, between marriages of choice and consent, what the NGO is doing is not feminist work. What should its work be? Do you see what I mean? It's a far more contaminated context, a far more contaminated terrain, rather than one where it's very clear cut that you should be, for child marriage and against a woman's agency, consent, whatever. So yeah, just one small example. And what was the other? Sorry, what was the other question? What was the last question?
Subject, other than Nandini's question about
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think you've got that. But basically, I think the point is that I'm trying to see feminism as an object which has a very wide range of variances, purchases, but then it does raise kind of interesting normative questions, which I think is the Sabah Mahmood project of, is it enough to say then any practice is feminist? Or do we then need some kind of predetermined criteria as to what practice then is feminist or isn't? I don't know. Or is it that our practice might be intended in totally different ways and has some effects which goes against patriarchal norms and some effects which reproduce patriarchal norms? And there's a lot to suggest that in the queer movement, practices that are intended to destabilize gender and sexuality actually have the opposite effect. And now, in fact, there's anecdotal evidence to suggest that queer movements, I don't know if people heard, in one queer pride, they were actually singing the national anthem. And there have been, again, like posters where there's all this kind of merging of Islamophobia and homonationalism, etc. So these are progressive spaces which are obviously having effects which stabilize norms rather than destabilize that. But you would ordinarily consider that to be feminist, queer, etc. Right? So I don't know. I think the Mahmood stuff the Sabah Mahmood work is useful to really to actually just think about practices at that level, as what effects they have, and then how do you judge, I suppose, rather than thinking in advance that it is feminist or it's not feminist.
Okay, Srilla, you happy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
I feel like I want to the gym.